Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the Battlefield 6 Open Beta. This is wrapping up as I'm recording this. It's currently Sunday, so this is the last day of the Open Beta, and the full game is going to launch in October. They've got some time to iron out some of the issues the game has, but it remains to be seen whether or not they're actually going to. Obviously, it's EA, anything can happen, and we saw how Battlefield 2042 went, which was absolutely atrocious. So the bar to clear for improvement on Battlefield 2042 was so low it was basically next to dinosaur bones, meaning that I have been extremely skeptical of all of the positive sentiment that has come out towards the game. Obviously, I haven't enjoyed a game in the Battlefield franchise since Bad Company 2, and the franchise has been getting further and further away from what made the original formula great ever since Battlefield 2142. So the question here is whether or not this is going to be a reversal in the trend, whether it's going to be a return to form, as the games media these days are so fond of parroting for games that are definitely not returns to form. And what I experienced during the beta was very much a mixed bag. On the one hand, I can very easily confirm it is a massive improvement over Battlefield 2042. Again, that is not saying much at all. That game was so bad that when it originally launched, I couldn't even review it because it was basically unplayable. And even after 2 years worth of patching and content updates and such, the game was still absolute garbage. And if you want to know more about that, I'll go ahead and throw up a link to the Battlefield 2042 video I made. But as for Battlefield 6, well, significant improvement in terms of engine technology. They have brought back destruction in a big way, and it's pretty much back to Bad Company 2 levels of destruction, so they've done a very good job with that. I didn't encounter too many glitches, and the ones I did encounter were just mild things like the physics glitching out on occasion, most of which was fairly amusing. The occasional glitch where my weapon would just disappear, but when I went to reload, it would reappear, and then it fixed itself, or things like that. Just nuisances that pop up during gameplay that really aren't that big of a deal. Although I did run into some annoying problems with being able to get into matches, which resulted at first in the matchmaking just taking a long time and then erroring out and not being able to get into matches, and which on the second weekend resulted in me not even being able to pull up the matchmaking queue at all. Both of these were pretty easy to fix, however. All they required was that I did a repair on the installation, and then it was right back to working properly. One technical aspect that EA definitely needs to be very cognizant of, however, is that they were clearly not prepared for this open beta in terms of how much traffic the game got, and so there were server queues. So people had to just sit in line waiting until the main menu would open up. You can't even get to the main menu without connecting to the game servers, which is frankly idiotic beyond belief. You should at the very least be able to get to the main menu, mess around with the game options, and mess around with your control options without having to connect to EA's servers, but they don't even let you do that. And frankly, I am incredibly sick of this kind of crap being pulled in pretty much every AAA game these days. This downright obnoxious, always online DRM, effectively, that forces you to be connected to the game servers even if you're just going to be playing single player. I mean, I will be somewhat fair in saying that at least this is primarily a multiplayer game. It's going to have a single player component, and as far as I'm concerned, you should be able to play that regardless of whether you can connect to the game servers or not. But obviously, EA doesn't give a single solitary crap about your consumer rights, so we're stuck with this always online DRM crap until the Stop Killing Games initiative actually bears fruit, if it ever does bear fruit. Problem with that, of course, being that the legislative process is very slow, so we're talking probably several years before anything actually gets done, even with the initiative meeting its goal of signatures and such. So, I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. But anyway, point is that it has the always online crap. It put us into server queues because they just didn't have enough server capacity available, even for apparently the authentication server, because that's all it really needs to get you to the main menu. And while I expect that there is going to be considerably more traffic for the game during this beta than there will be on the game's launch, hopefully they'll have remedied the server situation by then. Next, as far as the technical aspects are concerned, the game generally runs quite well. I was running this thing maxed out at 1080p on an RTX 3080 12GB model, Ryzen 9 5900X, and 64 gigs of RAM, And while my system is definitely no longer top of the line, it's still a high-end rig, don't get me wrong, but it's not top of the line anymore, I was still getting generally quite good performance. The way they've set up the FPS counter in the game is a bit weird, because they have it split between your processor and your graphics card, and it seems more concerned about the actual frame timings than the frame rate, so I don't really know what they were doing with that. And my overlay that would normally display the frames per second wasn't working with the game, so I couldn't see what a general frame rate count was going to be. But based on the counters that were actually present in the game, generally speaking, the game was running well above 60 frames per second at nearly all times. There were certain maps where it did slow down a bit, particularly Empire State, and while I was expecting the performance to degrade pretty severely when all of the destruction was playing out, it actually didn't. It ran quite well even during those cases, so it was generally a very smooth experience through and through. And given how good the game looks, it's actually pretty surprising they've managed to get it to run this well. If nothing else, it's a significant breath of fresh air compared to all of the Unreal Engine 5 games that have been coming out and running like complete garbage and being barely even playable, or even stuff like the last two id Tech games, which had some pretty rough performance thanks to the forced ray tracing and all that. Battlefield 6, on the other hand, definitely has that AAA level of visual fidelity, but it also runs well, and it's on maps that are fairly large compared to pretty much all other first-person shooters at this point, although not quite as large as it used to be in the Battlefield series, and obviously with the high player counts you expect from Battlefield and the amount of environmental destruction on display. So if nothing else, everybody who was working on the engine and optimization definitely deserve heaps of praise leveled on them because they've done a very good job with that. The rest of the game, though, well, that's a bit more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, the sound designers are still mostly doing a rather great job. They've got some nice punchy sound effects, they got the environmental stuff going on. There's plenty of callbacks to the previous Battlefield games, particularly Battlefield 3 and 4 as far as a lot of the audio cues are concerned, which is, of course, a deliberate choice. They have made it very clear that they are keeping Battlefield 3 and 4 in particular in mind as the kind of guiding star for what they want to bring the series back to, although we'll get to that here in a moment. But I do have to say that there is some oddness here and there, stuff that can be tightened up by the time the game launches in full. Just things like certain weapons not really sounding quite as good as you would expect, or being balanced slightly oddly, particularly on the War Tapes setting, which is a bit exaggerated to begin with, although it's my preferred way to set the sound in Battlefield games ever since they made it a feature. But again, it's not really a major issue, just some slight oddities that can be tightened up later. But the real elephants in the room are the UI designers, the gameplay mechanic designers, and the map designers. And I'm going to start with the UI designers because they have done the same kind of thing that's happened to pretty much every AAA first-person shooter, really just AAA game in general these days, which is to say that the UI takes cues primarily from streaming apps like Hulu, Netflix, and so on and so forth. And while it's definitely not quite as terrible as the UI in Battlefield 5 or Battlefield 2042, there's still dramatically inefficient use of space, and it's just generally clunky and annoying to navigate. I don't know why it is so difficult for UI designers to understand that not everything is supposed to look like, say, Netflix or Hulu or whatever, and is actually going to be navigated in very different ways depending on what input devices you have. Please do us all a favor and stop with this obnoxious modern UI design and just go back to what we had in the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation. That all worked fine, it looked fine, and nobody complained about it back then. Now you just get constant complaints about it, and instead of actually fixing it, you just keep doubling down on the design, as if that's going to somehow make the complaints go away. It's not gonna happen, so just go back to older styles of UI design. They work better, they look fine. Stop trying to make this stupid Hulu-esque design a thing. Now that I've rambled about the UI enough, let's talk about the real meat of the game here, at least as far as this beta was concerned. So, the game design and the map design. So, I'll start with map design because I have less to say about that. There weren't that many maps on display here. We had Liberation Peak, Siege of Cairo, Empire State, and Iberian Offensive, with Empire State being added in the second weekend of the beta and the other 3 being available from the beginning. And while there was a sampling of modes to play on these maps that included Domination and Squad Deathmatch, the 2 modes that I actually played throughout the entire beta were Conquest and Breakthrough. I'm sure you're probably wondering why I didn't mess around with all of the modes, especially why I didn't mess around with Rush, and it's pretty simple. The first is that I have no interest in playing Domination or Squad Deathmatch when it comes to Battlefield. This is not why I play the Battlefield franchise. I will mess around with those when the full game is out, but I don't really feel the need to mess around with that during a beta, because those modes were always a pitiful attempt to ape Call of Duty, and that's not what the series should be doing in the first place. As for Rush, well, I tried to get into a Rush match, and it didn't work. I don't know why, but the matchmaking would not put me into a Rush match. I guess there just weren't any open at the time I was messing around with it, so I just went back to Breakthrough and Conquest. Now, of course, Conquest is the flagship mode of Battlefield. It has been in the franchise since the very beginning, back in Battlefield 1942, and it is historically what the series has excelled at, even in the games that aren't particularly good. It is, however, something that is a bit tricky to design maps for, because you need to be able to design the maps in a way to where you're going to have battle lines that are going to form naturally, where one team might be defending the position and the other team might be attacking it, or vice versa. This is where that combined arms gameplay really shines, and where teamwork is really essential, and that is historically where the experience of Battlefield has really shined. Call of Duty is primarily about the individual, just this very fast-paced, arcadey gameplay experience where you just go in to relax and have a good time. Battlefield, on the other hand, has always been a much slower paced, much more teamwork-oriented game, and yet as the series has progressed, it has just continued to get further and further away from that experience. This, of course, culminated in Battlefield 2042, and Battlefield 6 is a pretty dramatic course correction from that. However, it wasn't quite dramatic enough, because the map designs in this game are frankly just absolute crap. Especially Siege of Cairo and Empire State. Holy crap, those maps are terrible. They're both focused on densely packed urban warfare, with Siege of Cairo having vehicle support and Empire State not having vehicles. And the only way I can really describe how they play is just as a chaotic clusterfuck. There's really no other way to describe it. It is a complete mess. And they just inevitably turn into absolute meat grinder matches, especially on modes where one team is explicitly the attacker and the other team is explicitly the defender, such as Breakthrough and, of course, what I didn't actually get to play during the beta, Rush. That's not to say that the other maps didn't have their problems when it came to specific modes, but Empire State and Siege of Cairo, just in general, are awful maps. The map set in Iberia, on the other hand, is okay, I guess, and Liberation Peak is okay on Conquest, but if you're playing that one on Breakthrough, or I presume Rush as well, it turns into the absolute meat grinder because of the way the map is laid out. But absolutely none of these maps actually click as far as the Battlefield gameplay is concerned. They all have something wrong with them in one way or another. Obviously, Empire State and Siege of Cairo both have the chaotic clusterfuck problem happening, but Liberation Peak and Iberian Conquest both have problems getting the whole battle line concept going, and as you might have noticed in the gameplay footage I've been showing you of those two maps, you'll see the various objective points are pretty much always in flux. Each team is constantly capturing and then losing and then recapturing these points at a rate that's pretty much unheard of in the older Battlefield games. It was a much more gradual experience in those, and even when you get to the likes of Battlefield 3 and 4, which were still pretty far removed from the Battlefield 2 experience, for example, it still didn't have this effect quite as severely. It's an effect that has resulted in the general experience of gameplay not feeling like Battlefield as much as it feels like Call of Duty's ground war mode. And this brings me to a general problem with the Battlefield franchise that has been getting more pronounced as the years have gone on. As the franchise has been dragged more in the Call of Duty direction because EA sees dollar signs and that's what they want to chase, they've continually pushed longtime Battlefield fans away, and people who had been previously playing Call of Duty and didn't like the direction that franchise was going started trickling into Battlefield, and it was abundantly clear when you were running into these people because they would have absolutely no idea what they were doing. This is where the whole PTFO meme comes from, play the friggin' objective, where longtime Battlefield players just got increasingly frustrated with all these players who had no idea what they were doing, who were just running around like headless chickens, concerned primarily about their KD ratios rather than playing the objective and actually winning matches. And that only further divided the player base, because the Call of Duty converts generally didn't care much about assimilating into the Battlefield formula. They just always wanted something that was like Call of Duty but bigger. And as the longtime Battlefield players have been continually pushed out of the franchise, and they've been effectively replaced with these Call of Duty converts, calls for playing the objective have gotten weaker and weaker. You've gotten less and less people actually caring about playing the objective and more about just doing whatever the hell they feel like on the battlefield. And then finally you get to Battlefield 2042, which was just a complete disaster all around, and pretty much all the Battlefield fans just completely checked out at that point, and they were just like, nope, I'm done. There's other games out there that are giving me the experience that I actually want. There's no point to going back to this. And while the Battlefield 6 beta did bring some of those people back, it clearly wasn't enough, because the general experience of playing Battlefield 6's open beta was more or less like playing Call of Duty Ground War, where absolutely nobody is communicating, and I do mean no communication whatsoever. I had voice chat on the entire time I was messing around with this beta, and not a single person used it. Even the text chat in nearly the entirety of the matches I played was almost exclusively silent, or at the very end of a match you would see maybe one or two GGs, or at absolute best you might have somebody complaining about the team not playing the objectives or something like that, but it would never actually end up in any kind of tactical discussions. So whereas like, hey, we're gonna go do this, we're gonna do that, they didn't even use the in-game callouts. Things like need ammo, need medical, or whatever. They didn't even use those. And in the extremely few instances where those in-game prompts were used, you couldn't tell who was using them because the game doesn't have anything to indicate who is requesting ammo, who's requesting revive, anything like that. Not that you have many options in that regard anyway, because about the only thing you can do is request ammo or request a ride, and that's about it. You can't even request an order from your squad leader like you could in, say, Battlefield 4, where you'd be like, hey, squad leader, what are we gonna do? And then your squad leader would be able to ping an objective, so that your squad would then have an objective you could coordinate towards. There's still the ability for the squad leader to ping an objective as the intended target, and then you can go do that, but there's no way to request an order from them, and there's no way to replace the squad leader, except for when the squad leader leaves the squad, and it just rotates to whoever is next in line. So most of the time, you're stuck with your squad leader probably not even knowing their squad leader and probably not caring that they're squad leader, so they're not pinging objectives. You can't request an order from them. You're getting no communication from your squad mates, no communication from your teammates. You're not even getting pings on where the enemies are most of the time. The spot mechanic is still in this game, but between it being a bit janky and not always registering the spots the way you would really expect them to, and just players in general not using it, it may as well not even be in the game in the first place. And this is all a serious problem, because teamwork is the core pillar of Battlefield's gameplay design. And if players aren't going to be communicating and working together as a team, then the entire gameplay experience just collapses. Hence me saying it feels like Call of Duty's Ground War mode rather than Battlefield. And that one problem, more than anything else, has just completely ruined the entire open beta experience. Because if you're just looking at individual mechanics, there's not really much to complain about there. I mean, sure, shotguns are currently a bit overpowered, and some of the weapon balancing can definitely be tweaked. And of course, they're still not entirely sure how they should divvy up the various squad responsibilities among the 4 classes, because really they've condensed them down too much. They probably should expand that into 5 classes instead of 4, but they just keep sticking to 4 classes. And bonus points for removing class-specific weapons in the primary game modes. They had closed weapon modes available for testing. Keep in mind, closed weapon modes are the way that Battlefield is supposed to function, where each class has the specific weapons it's supposed to use. For example, Assault class has assault rifles, Support class has machine guns, Engineer has submachine guns, and Recon has sniper rifles. In the open weapon modes, anybody can have anything. In closed weapon modes, each of those classes has those specific weapons locked to them, and then there is the selection of universal weapons that can be applied to any of them, which are carbines and DMRs. Basically the same setup that was in Battlefield 4, which absolutely nobody was ever complaining about, and they decided to do away with it in this one because, well, they did away with it in Battlefield 2042, where they had all the players being specialists rather than classes, even though they introduced classes again much later on, and it failed spectacularly. And so, when they bring back classes into Battlefield 6, now they're just half-assing it with that. They give each class these special abilities, of course, but then you've got open weapon selection. Like, why bother doing that? Just have the closed weapons be the default. Stop trying to hide the closed weapon modes, because that's what they did the first weekend. They outright hid the closed weapon mode behind a couple of the other modes, so you had to go digging through the menu to find it, thus poisoning all the data that they're going to be getting from which modes are the most played, because they basically implied that closed weapons, which is the Battlefield staple, is actually an alternative mode for this that's not the intended gameplay experience. So they're going to get all this data back that says the vast majority of players didn't play the closed weapon modes, probably because they just didn't know it was a thing, or they thought there was some alternate gameplay mode, and go, "See? The players actually want open weapons." And then they'll use that poison data as justification for either removing the closed weapon modes from the game entirely, or reducing them down to an extra mode that's on top of the other stuff and is very limited by comparison, so you can only play maybe 1 or 2 game modes on it, which is basically what happened in the second weekend, where they added in the rush mode, but didn't add it to the closed weapon playlist. The closed weapon playlist was only breakthrough and conquest, so if you wanted to play rush, you had to play it in open weapons mode. So now they're going to have even more of this poison data supporting the open weapons mode, simply because they stacked the deck against the closed weapons modes. They had decided before the game was even available to the public that they were going to do open weapons, because they are chasing the Call of Duty crowd. And the Call of Duty crowd doesn't like restrictions. They like being able to just use whatever. If it's a cramped close quarters map, who cares? Use a sniper rifle. That's totally fine in Call of Duty. The problem is, that's not how Battlefield works. Battlefield breaks down when people can just do whatever the hell they want. And while you might think something as simple as being able to choose whatever weapon you want for whatever class you're using isn't that big of a deal, think about it this way. Each class is supposed to have its defined role. The Engineer is the vehicle specialist. They repair vehicles and they have anti-vehicle weapons. The Assault class is the frontline combatant. They are supposed to get in the thick of things and punch through the enemy lines with superior firepower. The Support class, I feel like, is actually taking on too many roles at this point. It's the Medic, and it's the Fire Support class where it lays down suppressing fire, and it's the class that provides you with ammo and health packs. It's just, they've got a bit too much on their shoulders. That role should actually be split up between 2 different classes. This is where I think that additional class would really come in handy, where you would have one class kind of being the dedicated medic and the other class being kind of the dedicated support specialist. And you could also take a bit of the recon's responsibilities away and give them to the dedicated support class. For example, being able to put down a respawn beacon. That has been a recon feature for a while, and it gets abused to no end, where people just go to the edge of the map, place down a respawn beacon, and then just continually respawn in the same spot and keep sniping people from the edge of the map. That's how it's been since, well, the Bad Company days even. And they've never really been able to balance it out all that well, so when you get to this one, I think they mentioned that they're going to be removing the respawn beacon from the Recon class and giving it to the Assault class instead, which, if you're doing open weapons as the primary mode, isn't going to matter. The assault class will just spawn with a sniper rifle, and they'll put down a respawn beacon somewhere, and even if it breaks every time they respawn at it, guess what? They can just put down another one. The problem persists unless you take the respawn beacon and give it to a specific class that can't use sniper rifles. The solution here is painfully obvious, yet they are so hell-bent on open weapons being the way Battlefield 6 is gonna play that they're just going to perpetuate the problem instead of actually fixing it like they seem to think they're going to do. And while that kind of attitude might win them brownie points with the Call of Duty crowd, it doesn't really win them points with the Battlefield crowd. Battlefield fans are like, look, this doesn't play right. It doesn't have the battle lines thing going on. It doesn't have the same kind of feel that we expect from a Battlefield game. It feels like Call of Duty Ground War. You have an entire back catalog of Battlefield games that did feel like Battlefield games, even if they were in various states of mess, to draw inspiration from and see what they did well, what they didn't do well. It was based on all of the feedback that those games have had over the years, and understand what makes a Battlefield game, and yet despite all of that, they just don't get it. And frankly, I don't think they care about getting it. They have their idea that this is going to be the Call of Duty killer. And I hate to break it to you, but the only thing that's ever going to kill Call of Duty is Call of Duty. It would have to be continual releases in an absolutely atrocious state, to the point where the games are basically unplayable. And even the worst Call of Duty games are not quite that bad. I mean, think about this. Even as bad as World at War Final Fronts is, and it's the worst game in the franchise, it's still an infinitely more playable game than Battlefield 2042 was. EA does not have the level of franchise entrenchment with Battlefield as Activision does with Call of Duty. It's just not even remotely close. And yet the execs at EA are acting like Call of Duty is going to be dethroned by Battlefield 6, that Battlefield 6 is going to reach 100 million players, which is a downright insane figure for a Battlefield game, considering that all of the Battlefield games combined don't reach 100 million sales. So I don't know where they're getting this incredibly optimistic 100 million players, even if you consider that there is going to be a free-to-play Battle Royale mode or whatever, basically the same thing that Call of Duty does with Warzone. It's still just an insanely high target to hit, and I really don't see that happening with this thing. I mean, hell, when I was messing around with this beta, I was already pretty much done with the whole gameplay experience on the first weekend, so when the second weekend rolled around, I only played a few matches before I decided, you know what, I think I'm done with this beta. I'm gonna go ahead and make the video now. And honestly, I really don't have much desire to play the full game at this point based on what I've messed with during the beta. It's not that it was necessarily a bad game, but it just doesn't feel like Battlefield. It feels like it's trying to be Call of Duty Ground War, and the player base seems to have fully embraced that, because as far as I can tell, pretty much everybody playing this at this point is just a Call of Duty convert who doesn't know how to play a Battlefield game. So I find myself left with the general thought that while this game is certainly playable, it functions well for the most part on a technical level, and the gunplay is fine. It's nothing amazing, but it's fine for a Battlefield game. It's got some neat things in it. I mean, the dragged while reviving thing, I actually like that. But at the end of the day, I just can't shake the feeling that I'm playing what is ostensibly supposed to be Battlefield, but feels like Call of Duty's Ground War mode, and if I wanted to play Call of Duty, I would just play Call of Duty. And I can't help but wonder how many players of this beta feel exactly the same way. Think about it this way, too. The last time that Battlefield truly felt right, like it was actually going in the right direction and improving, was Battlefield 2. That game came out in 2005. 20 years ago, as I am recording this audio right now. Meanwhile, the last time it felt like Battlefield was at least trying to get the proper Battlefield experience and was just having difficulty doing so by trying to condense everything down to make it more palatable to console audiences, was Bad Company 2, which released in 2010. We are so far removed from those days at this point that Battlefield has an entirely different audience now. Pretty much all of the old school Battlefield fans have either stopped gaming entirely, or have moved on to even more heavily teamwork-oriented games like Arma, or Squad, or Hell Let Loose, or these other sort of more milsim type games, rather than the more arcadey teamwork-oriented experience of Battlefield. So now Battlefield is stuck in a rut where they can't really persuade the old fans to come back because they've just moved on to more complicated games. So they basically have to dumb it down for the Call of Duty crowd, but the Call of Duty crowd doesn't want to play teamwork-oriented games, they just want to run around like headless chickens. And given what I was experiencing during the Battlefield 6 open beta, I feel like we finally hit the critical mass of that, where there simply aren't enough of the old school Battlefield players anymore to be able to get the old school Battlefield experience. It's just gonna feel like Call of Duty Ground War from here on out, because pretty much the entire audience at this point is just Call of Duty converts. And again, look, if I wanted to play Call of Duty, I would just play Call of Duty. If I'm going to play a Battlefield game, it's because I want to have the Battlefield experience. And not only have I not been able to consistently get that proper Battlefield experience since Bad Company 2, but it's gotten less and less frequent with each subsequent game to Battlefield Bad Company 2. And now we're at the Battlefield 6 open beta. Supposedly a return to form for the Battlefield franchise, and I didn't even get it once. I guess we'll see how the full game turns out in October, but after having played the open beta here, I am not remotely optimistic for it. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.